I'm Joshua, and I'm an INTP, and first and foremost, I would like to say thank you for viewing this video and subsequently visiting this channel. The topic of this video will be on intuition, and the reason I want to visit the subject of intuition is because it's the case that there's a few different currents moving through typological analysis or the personality theory community, and it's the case that I'm not only hearing it from one source, but I'm hearing it from several sources that the functions might be being reduced and condensed to being essentially equal to one another. And by the functions, I mean specifically introverted intuition and extroverted intuition. It's the case that there are proponents of the argument that since neuroscience and cognitive science and different personality inventories that are littered with research show that you can basically constellate most traits into a single cluster known as openness to experience, that you can basically constellate extroverted intuition and introverted intuition into one complex. But it's the case that openness to experience doesn't translate directly to the intuitive veins of being in Jungian typology, because it's also the case that you could summate extroverted sensing with extroverted intuition and introverted intuition, and that summation or clusters of traits would probably most accurately describe the characteristic or the personality dimension in the Big Five inventory of openness to experience. You can't necessarily parsimony, and you see how it kind of gets messy, because if you were analyzing it from the standpoint of the cognitive function axes, why is it such that the introverted intuition, extroverted intuition fit in the complex of openness to experience, but only extroverted intuition fits into the complex and not introverted sensing, which would probably be more tightly associated with the trait of conscientiousness. It's like conscientiousness, you basically take extroverted thinking, introverted sensing, and you smush those things together and you get the trait of conscientiousness. But that's a rough kind of description. That's not even necessarily accurate. The reason why you have these problems in trying to translate MBTI over into the Big Five, though many people are proposing that they're the same thing, is because MBTI, or Jungian typology, is a theoretical model that has little professional empirical grounding. It's mostly something that's done locally and by lay analysts, and it's the case that the Big Five is theoretical, predicated on genetics, and it's a linguistic-based model, and it's the case that it's also not depth psychology, which it would probably be more apt to describe the Big Five model as affective neuroscience or cognitive behavioral theory, but it's not depth psychology, which is what MBTI would be. So the lines get crossed and the signals get switched. So it's not the case that you can translate the two back and forth between one another, though there are many people that propose that, or that they're using the literature. Now, I use literature from other psychological domains, if you will, but it's not the case that I'm ever confused about what I'm doing when I'm mixing and matching the pieces and playing with an idea over here versus dealing with an idea in this domain. You have to understand things from a conceptual and a theoretical standpoint. You can't just take data and facts and slam them together and think that that gives you something, it necessarily gives you something intelligible or new about the phenomenon that you're concerned with. Though I hear it a lot, and even if they're not using the big five explicitly as a motivation or a reason or other ideas within psychological research for their motivations and their ideas about how they're viewing MBTI, they certainly have it embedded in their content implicitly. And it's the case that I've heard it too often for comfort that extroverted intuition and introverted intuition are essentially the same things. And I would even say from a neuroscientific standpoint that that's not valid, because you would have to ask necessarily what types and what modes of thinking or what cognitive processes outside of the description of the cognitive functions does extroverted intuition and introverted intuition entail. And it's the case that whenever you're looking at intuition of any variety, it's not such that the well, I could say it like this. So if you're all types of cognition is a form of thinking. Though the dichotomies kind of are messed up in terms of this descriptive tools that you have in MBTI. It's not the case that human beings don't think. I mean, like, that's not reality. It's the case that you have different types of thinking, and it's the case that you have different types of memory in the brain. At least that's how it's modeled in other domains of neuroscientific or psychological inquiry. And it's the case that whenever, so probably I should start here. I should start like track back and say this, that probably the research that's going to be able to tell you the most about what intuition is the research in the literature that's done in the study of creativity as a personality dimension and a trait. And it's the case that when researchers are looking at, and the reason I say that is because basically well, not basically, but extroverted intuition is essentially functional in its makeup, in the sense that it tends to classify its associations and the ways that things can be related and categorized with what you can do with a thing. It's the fact that if a door swings open and a book swings open in the same fashion, then they're hinged like objects, and the extroverted intuitive type is going to do something with that invariant that it extracts or abstracts from their functionality. Just as a case that, I said this in another video, that if you can live in a house and you can live in a cave and you can live in a shoe, then they're all essentially shelters. And if they're writing a book or something, they might have something living in a shoe. Something small enough, like a mouse, or like I think Mother Goose lived in a shoe or something like that. Because, sometimes you find spiders in there. So, well, I guess it depends on the region that you live in. So that's extroverted intuition's associative makeup. And in a sense, it's described, it can be best described by its tendencies towards what researchers call loose association and divergent modes of thinking. And it's the case that introverted intuition is summating. Observations over time is the best description. Observations over time and coalescent association is the best description of what introverted intuition does. Introverted intuition makes its associations to possibly through the functionality of a thing, possibly through the characteristics of a thing, possibly through a multitude of varying different descriptions. and the way that these things are coalesced or sort of coerced into adhesion by the introverted thinker, the introverted intuitive type, is not at all clear. But it is the case that the introverted intuitive types produce identities in models of makeup in existence. That's what they do with their intuition, and they take a bit from the functional standpoint. They take a bit from the property standpoint. An introverted intuitive type is going to watch the flow of a waterfall, and then they're going to think about a really difficult task that they have to do in life that seems insurmountable, and they're going to reflect on when they were looking at the waters underneath the waterfall. They were rather smooth and small, but the waterfall is etched in. But they know the waterfall was etched in a mountain, and these had to be jagged rocks, and it had to be the case that at one point in time they were tall obstacles that the water had to move around and make way for. But over time, the waterfall just continues to flow and drop down on them, and they're smoothed out. And over time, they yield to the force of the waterfall, but the waterfall does not yield to the force of or the imposition that they present. And so the introverted intuitive type is going to think, well, eureka, it's like the flow of a waterfall at which I should approach these tasks. And, it's going to be something like much more definite than that. But, like, I mean, obviously, that's not how my introverted intuition works, so I don't know. But that's the best projection from what I can understand from reading Carl Jung, is the way that it tends to work. And it's the case that when you're dealing with that type of thinking, it too is predicated on loose associations. That seems to be the key factor between all modes of intuition. But it is the case that introverted intuition is far more embedded within the subconscious, and it is the case that introverted intuition is convergent in its creations rather than divergent. And it's here at the, I guess, stop of the difference between convergence and divergence that I really want to highlight, because it's basically the case that there are divergent thinking tasks and there are convergent thinking tasks, and by task I mean items on a battery that some psychologist is going to give some unsuspecting individual to take to gauge their levels of creativity. And it's a case that these batteries we know that they describe two different modes of thought process or cognitive processing within individuals, and it's the case that convergent and divergent thinking are not the same things. They're not the same things at all. And the test that shows this the best is the remote association task, the remote association test. Remote association task. The remote associations, in the sense, what a remote association task is this: you have a word like crab, apple, and dollar, and you need to figure out the fourth word that links all of these words together. And the word would be apple in this case. No, excuse me, the word would be tree in this case, because it said apple. So yeah, apple tree, crab tree, and dollar tree. So yeah, and so that's the task, and that's from what I analyzed, that's what an introverted intuitive type does essentially. They find items that may not be necessarily linked in their specific identities, and they may not be necessarily linked in the functionality or the way the thing shows up in the world, but there is some fourth overarching underlying aspect or idea that could associate those three things, and da da da. There you have the introverted intuitives revelation. And when researchers look to see what type of cognitive processes that the remote association task utilizes, they are indeed convergent, and it's not the case that the remote association task is divergent, and it's not the case that introverted intuition is divergent. It's not the case that extroverted intuition is convergent in its in its nature. It's also this that all people have intuition from the standpoint, because everybody says this, but I mean, if you're going to be strict about it, and what we understand from research, all people have intuition from a certain from a certain perspective, in the sense that all people have expectations, and the intuition that some researchers are talking about are the items of assumptions that guide the expectations of an individual, that causes them to make decisions in the environment. And it's the case that the intuition that other researchers are talking about are what people would classically consider as imagination, or imagination. I think that's the best descriptive tool. And it's not the case that those things inform one another, but it's not the case that they're the same thing. Not from a neuroscientific standpoint. And it's also the case that when you're dealing with introverted intuition versus extroverted intuition, one is far more subconscious than the other. And it is the case, like, just from my analyses, that when one is talking about the prevalence of eureka moments in one's life, one is an introverted intuitive type. That's not even funny to me, because it's the case that introverted intuition, unlike extroverted intuition, is mostly elicited through the cognitive process of transient hypofrontality. And it's not the case that most people can't experience transient hypofrontality. Everybody can, because it's a downregulation of the frontal regions. It's just the case that there are some people that are more prone to experiencing transient hypofrontality than other people, and their brains seem to be downregulated. It's also their frontal regions seem to be in a state of downregulation more readily than other people. And they're more prone to experiencing the phenomenon of daydreaming and various other factors. And it's not the case that everybody's like that. It's not the case that everybody's like that at all. And I mean, I'm not one to say that people aren't essentially the same, but I don't like it when it's the case that people treat all differences as if they're superficial, and they completely muddy up a category because of egalitarianism or whatever. Like, I hate that. And that's what I sometimes suspect is going on with the analysis that's out in the world these days, and with some things that I've been reading. I mean, like, everybody's not the same. Now, further in staying to that point of transient hypofrontality, it's the case that eureka moments are going to be much more prevalent to introverted intuitive types than they are going to be to extroverted intuitive types. And it's not going to be the case that they experience them in the same way. Or, because extroverted intuition many times feels like observations. It feels like you're watching something happen rather than coming up with something. It feels empirical, but it's not. It's not empirical. Don't let anybody tell you that extroverted intuition is empirical or is based on observation, because that's not the case. But to where introverted intuition is not like that. It's revelatory, and with an enormous feeling of certainty and security behind the conclusions it comes up with, to where extroverted intuition just doesn't have that luxury. So with that said, extroverted intuition and introverted intuition are different. One's divergent and one's convergent. One is better understood. They're both characterized by loose associations, and one's better understood through subconscious processing. So, and that one would be introverted intuition, to where extroverted intuition isn't. And I'd have to do another video on a neuroscientific description of what extroverted intuition is, because it's kind of honestly, it's kind of more messy to try and figure out than introverted intuition, because because the way that researchers work in creativity literature, they do a lot of case studies, which means they just read the biographies or whatever somebody said about some eminent figure, and then they start constructing their theories and models of understanding something based off of what these individuals wrote, said, or did. And it's the case that you have an INTJ such as Archimedes to thank for the fact that most creativity research tends to think of all creative types as introverted intuitive types. But I digress. With that said, this is on intuition, and I hope you found that informative. Thank you.